Well, hello everybody, and welcome to the Maston Public Library, I guess, monthly science talk that I've been doing for all of this. Today, I'm going to talk about mostly the privatization of space travel or space technology and what implications that has. So I'm going to mostly talk, and if you have questions, just speak up, or you can use your little emoji icon to say that you want to say something. Um, so in the history of space travel, when you think of space travel, at least in the United States, you're probably thinking of NASA, because NASA is the primary source of everything that America sends into space. And NASA is, although it's not a branch of the government, it is a government program in the way that the post office is a government program. It's run largely by the government, it's funded by the government, and it's an effort of the United States to expand science and technology as it relates to space travel and launching capabilities. And much of it came out of the Cold War. If you remember history, when the Russians launched Sputnik, this was kind of a terrifying thing that you had this satellite that was now orbiting Earth, because if you could launch a satellite into orbit, then you could launch a nuclear weapon into orbit, and this started, the whole great space race that led to the United States eventually landing on the moon. Because of that, space travel has largely been government organized. It has been driven by government funding, it's been driven by government research, and it's served government purposes, whether that is defense purposes, prestige purposes, or scientific purposes. And in many ways, that's very different than a lot of other technologies. So if you think of something like airplanes, when airplanes were first invented, they were largely private things that were starting. So the Wright brothers was not a government-funded organization, it was a private organization. The early pilots and early plane builders were private companies. And it wasn't really until they began to use military uses that they were largely funded by government research in some sense. So space travel has largely been kind of backwards. It's been government funded from the get-go. And part of that is because of politics, but a lot of it is because it's just expensive to go into space. You're talking about millions and billions of dollars to launch something into space and develop the technology. And at least in the early stages, there wasn't a whole lot of profit to be made in launching something into space. So it was a whole lot of research for a high risk, low profit venture, which made sense for why the government would do it. But over time, as the space technology has become more common, private industry has moved into certain niches. So for example, while NASA still does, the type of things with crewed space flights, and the Russian space program does crewed space flights, a lot of satellite technology, launching communication satellites and everything into space, is done often by private industry. So you have private companies that are making rockets to launch satellites into space. So this has kind of been the model that a lot of the space research has done. You have something like NASA that does crewed missions and really pushing the envelope for going to the moon, building a space station, all sorts of things like that. And then you have private industry doing smaller launches of satellites and things that are used for businesses and large companies. Because once the technology is progressed to a certain stage, then large businesses can start using that for their own profits. What's happened recently, let's say probably within the last 10 years, is that you're starting to get private companies that are in many ways leading the way in space technology. So the two most common in the United States would be SpaceX, which is probably the most famous one. The other one would be Blue Origin. Both of these are funded by billionaires. It's kind of something out of some dystopian cyberpunk, where you now have billionaires that have their own private companies to launch things into space. but in a real sense, it's changing the way we're doing space research. So for example, SpaceX is getting approved to do crewed launches. They are now launching people to the International Space Station. The International Space Station is still a collaboration of governments. It's a government-owned project, but it's being, the crew members from the United States are being launched by a private rocket company. So SpaceX is doing it. And we are now at the point where, for example, in the United States, NASA has no way to launch humans into space right now. There's nothing NASA has. They used to have the space shuttle that was mothballed, and so all of the American astronauts until SpaceX had been launched by the Russian space program. So everyone had to go to Russia to get launched into space if you wanted to go to the International Space Station. So this has really kind of put the United States in a bit of a predicament. But it's interesting that government didn't pick up the slack. It is a private company that's picked up the slack. And when you look at companies like SpaceX, you're seeing in many ways they're pushing the envelope for technology that government is no longer doing. So you may have seen launches of SpaceX where they actually have staged rockets that they recycle. So the old kind of Apollo mission thing is launch something into space, the different stages burn up. Maybe they get parachuted down, but most of it's burned up and wasted, which makes it very expensive. SpaceX, their stages launch up, and when they detach, they come back and with computer systems launch land at a platform so they can be reused over and over again, which makes it much less expensive. This type of computer technology is far beyond what anything that NASA has right now. So in many ways, SpaceX is the most sophisticated space program in the world, and it's a private company. And so one of the interesting questions that you can ask is what happens with that change? And we're already starting to see some of it from hype. Elon Musk, who is the CEO of SpaceX, is a very eccentric figure, to put it lightly. And so he has plans and has very clearly stated plans to send people to Mars, for example. He wants to send them, I believe it's either 2024 or 2028, so very soon, launch humans to Mars. And he's made no bones about how he considers Mars to be private space. Whoever gets there gets to declare their control of Mars. The governments don't have the ability to control what happens on Mars. This is a very big change, for example. So when NASA landed on the moon, the United States didn't claim ownership of the moon. They didn't claim control of what's done on the moon. They were part of a government thing saying they went there in peace. It was a status symbol, but it was not trying to control the moon. And part of that is because only governments can get there. So when Musk says he's going to send people to Mars and basically start a colony, that kind of lies outside of international law. Right now, he hasn't sent anybody to Mars, so that's something that's just purely speculative at this point. But there are cases where private industry is kind of bumping up against where international law currently is. So one of the big examples would be the constellation of satellites, the Starlink program that SpaceX is doing, where they're launching up. Their plans are thousands of these little communication satellites so that you can have internet anywhere in the world. And on the one hand, that's really kind of cool. I mean, anybody who has dealt with our local internet provider, who will remain unnamed, can know the frustration of trying to get internet for a reasonable cost. And if somebody like Elon Musk can put a whole bunch of internet satellites in space, and all of a sudden you can get high-speed internet for $25 a month, that's not a bad deal. I think a lot of people would like that idea. It would also provide internet to really remote areas where you can't string a whole bunch of cable. So on the one hand, this is really positive. This private corporation is now launching its own satellites and building a network that can not only make them a lot of money, but actually do a lot of good in terms of connecting people around the world. The problem is that we don't have any regulations in place to determine who can launch satellites and who can't. So before private industry really got into place, because it was government organizations, governments worked together to ensure, for example, that the orbits of their satellites weren't conflicting. So there was this kind of international collaboration to say, we're going to do certain things, but we're going to let other countries know, and we're not going to interfere with other countries' space programs. So this is good because there's a limited amount of space in, say, for example, low Earth orbit. And so if you have governments that are working together, you can do this type of thing. But SpaceX is just launching up these satellites. And there's nothing to forbid them from launching up these satellites, but it's bumping up against other countries. So for example, there are countries like Chile that rely upon astronomy for some of their prestige and income. They have the vast majority of satellites in the world, telescopes in the world are in Chile because it's perfect viewing conditions. These satellites that are going up are creating these streaks of reflective light across all of their telescopes, which is making it much more difficult to do astronomy. So in some sense, these private satellites are invading Chilean airspace because it's going up against their ability to use astronomy as part of their economy. So where does that get resolved? Normally that would get resolved in terms of international negotiations, say in the UN or something, but now it's private industry. So who's to say what the regulations are? We haven't written a lot of laws about space travel because we haven't had to. Basically, if no one can go there, or it's very difficult to go there, then there's no need for a whole bunch of complex laws. In some sense, it's kind of like the South Pole. Excuse me. It's extremely difficult to get to the South Pole. It requires a large amount of funding to get there. So most of the places in Antarctica are government run. We haven't adjusted to the laws for what space travel is. Excuse me one moment. Sorry, just talking. I had a little bit of cough or tickle in my neck. So one of the questions that we haven't resolved and is going to be needed to be resolved very quickly is how do we address regulations and laws for various companies that go up there? This constellation of satellites is one thing that's kind of worrying because SpaceX is doing its Starlink thing. Blue Origin is doing one. I think there's a European company that's doing one. And you're going to have all these satellites, like thousands and thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit, which is far more than we've ever put into space. Space around the Earth is already pretty cluttered. But the problem is that if you put a whole bunch of satellites like there, what can happen is they can collide. And one of the risks that we have is that if satellites collide and they should throw debris out, that debris can hit other satellites and create more debris. And you get this whole cascade of satellite debris that just takes everything down. If you've ever seen the movie Gravity, that's a part of what triggers the drama within Gravity is this explosion of a satellite triggers a whole bunch of debris. It's not really realistically portrayed in the movie, but the idea is there that if basically SpaceX and other companies send a whole bunch of debris up into space, it could wipe out our entire satellite system. So that's one of the challenges that we haven't addressed. But the other side of it is that privatization of space travel is inevitable. In every field in which we've advanced technology, private industry has stepped up at some point when it becomes profitable. So no matter what we do, if there is some type of profit motive in there, companies are going to step up and do this. We've seen this with air travel, with cars, with now space travel, railroad systems, internet. The internet was started by the government and then became the central to our economy. All of these things, as soon as there is a profit margin, companies start farming to do this, to take advantage of this economy. And in space, we are reaching a point where there is now a lot of money to be made in space travel. So Starlink, for example, an internet communication system, is one way that you could make a lot of money if you can provide internet to the world. That's one economic incentive to do this. Going to Mars, going to the moon is another economic incentive. You can have everything from space tourism, where if you can make it cheap enough, people will pay to go into space or go to the moon. If you can go to the asteroid belt, you could start mining raw materials in the asteroid belt. And just as an example, if you have an asteroid that is roughly the size of a big house, it contains more mineral wealth than has been mined on Earth in the history of Earth. So there is a lot of money to be made in this, which means companies are going to be out there. We are not going to be able to just say, oh, we'll let the government do it all. So this transition that we're seeing to commercialization of space is inevitable. The question is, how do we navigate it? And that's an interesting question, because unlike a lot of industry, space is international. You can't simply, like mining in the United States, you can dig down, but you're still inside the borders of the United States. You can't just mine up, because things travel across your countries. So anything you put into orbit becomes an international object. And so we will have to figure out what those international laws are and where the limits of those laws are for anything that goes into space. We've kind of kicked the can down the road in terms of the law because we didn't have to worry about it. And we're finding out we have to start worrying about it very quickly. And so that's really kind of the next step is we're right now at a technological limit. Very soon, we're going to be at a legal limit. What is the law going to limit or allow within the technology? Because if someone can get to an asteroid, do they own the asteroid? We don't know. And so as we continue on this, as we expand all of this, there are a lot of both technological and legal challenges that we have to face. But despite all of that, one of the really exciting things about it is that as it becomes economically viable, it becomes accessible to more and more people. So one of the things you're starting to see is university classes and high school groups that can put things into low Earth orbit for a little bit. There's these little cube satellites, and they can be launched into space to do research things or to do fun projects and stuff. So space used to be something that only elite governments could do. And now we're finding that more and more, it's getting accessible to everyone. So just as when planes first started, they were a niche thing that only the wealthy hobbyist could do. Now, barring the pandemic, anyone can take a plane ride. Well, that idea of anyone can go into space is coming. That time is coming, whether or not for our generation, but for the next generation, it's going to be something that's common and easy to do. And that technology is going to change the way we live our lives. So that's kind of the big interesting thing about all of this. Are there any questions on this? Things anybody wants to ask? No? Okay, well, I hope you all enjoyed this. I can stay around after turning off the recording if you do have a question you want to ask off the recording. But I know there will be more of these in the future. They're usually about once a month. If you have an idea for a topic you'd like to hear about, let Stacy know. She is the one who schedules them. Other than that, if you don't have any other questions, I hope you had a good time, and I will see you next time.
Good. Ask him. Oh.